Served as a bomber squadron commander, bomb disposal technician, Joint Chiefs of Staff Operations Officer, assisted the National Security Team with the campaign plan for the global war on terrorism. He authored the first theater nuclear war plan and served as the Vice Commander of America's largest airborne intelligence wing. Colonel Rob Maness is a true American hero. This is Rob Maness Live.
Hold the seas. 11 nuclear-powered giants, each a floating city of firepower. But now there's a challenger, China. China is building the world's second-largest carrier fleet, fast. Its newest and most powerful carrier, the Fujian, launched in 2022, is a technological leap. It uses EMALS, an electromagnetic catapult system like America's Gerald R. Ford, allowing faster and more frequent fighter jet launches. The U.S. has more carriers, but China is closing the gap with speed, innovation, and strategy. It already has 2 active carriers, Liaoning and Shandong, and the Fujian is expected to join soon. But China's real power? Anti-ship missiles. The DF-21D and DF-26 are known as carrier killers, designed to sink U.S. ships before they get close. China isn't just copying the U.S., it's creating a whole new playbook. Dominate regional waters, use long-range missiles, and build naval power that stretches from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. The race is on, and the future of naval warfare may no longer be red, white, and blue.
Welcome back to More War Monday, folks. The Rob Maness Show's live on Worldview Tube and our X Spaces simulcast. Well, deterring China should be job one for America. In early June, China deployed both operational aircraft carriers and their 2 strike groups simultaneously to the Western Pacific for the first time in force and for a long period of time. This is a significant milestone for the People's Liberation Army Navy. These deployments, they demonstrate Beijing's blue water ambitions and the capability to project power outside the first and second island chains, sending a clear message to not only the United States and Taiwan, but also to Australia, Japan, and the Philippines. Well, China now has 2 operational carrier strike groups, as you just heard, and the 3rd carriers in sea trials. Meanwhile, the United States moved 2 Pacific Fleet carriers to the Middle East recently and announced the next Ford-class carrier will be delayed by 2 years. Well, American China policy has continuously neglected to account for China's military buildup and its unrestricted warfare against us while we unwisely put resources and time into other parts of the world. Fortunately, the Trump administration is making a concerted effort to make the long-awaited pivot to the Indo-Pacific theater to deter China, but do we have the political will to devote the vast amount of dollars and resources and effort needed to be successful? Well, my guest today is James E. Fennell. Jim is a career naval intelligence officer whose positions included senior intelligence officer for China at the Office of Naval Intelligence and chief of intelligence for CTF-70, the 7th Fleet, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He's a co-author of a new book, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. Jim, welcome to the Rob Maness Show. It's good to have you on.
Thanks, Rob. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, when I saw your article that you did a couple of weeks ago on carriers, it got my attention because I've been thinking for a long time, like you have, but this is unusual for an air guy, a bomber guy too, is that shipbuilding and ship manufacturing, both in the military world and the civilian world, in the United States and among our allies, isn't in the greatest shape. And your article talked about the seemingly unwillingness or some kind of pushback or hesitance to build new carriers in the United States. So you got my attention. China's already got our attention. Why is this second or this 2 aircraft carrier strike group deployment so important to the average observer? I mean, it's important to us, but.
Well, Rob, I think what the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy, did here in May and June for about a 3-week period was they sent their 2 operational carriers, the Liaoning and the Shandong, not just outside the first island chain, which is always a goal of the PLA Navy. Their senior admirals and politicians talk about how the first island chain, that chain that comes down from Japan through the Ryukyu Islands to Taiwan and then down through the Philippines, that island chain is kind of like an albatross around their neck, or a chain that keeps them from being able to be a global navy and a normal big great power nation. So that's always the first objective, is to break through that. And they've been doing that successfully since 2006 with submarines and surface vessels, and even with their aircraft carriers. But this time they sent both of their carriers out. And then the next thing that they did is that they stayed at sea for a period of 3 weeks, which shows sustainment capability. So they were operating away from any divert landing fields. And so they were flying hundreds of sorties in this period of time that they were underway with their jet aircraft, the J-15, and they didn't have any mishaps, and they were able to operate and continue to have high rates of sorties, a high operational tempo. And they did that without carrier onboard delivery aircraft like our aircraft carriers have, which demonstrates that they had the right amount of parts and personnel and maintainers to be able to keep flying and not have to worry about going back and having somebody fly out more parts and materiel to you. So that's a signal. But the most important one was when they sent the Liaoning east of the second island chain, which is that second island chain comes down from Tokyo Bay, basically to Iwo Jima, and then down to Guam, and then down into the southern South Pacific. And that second island chain is like another double distance from the first island chain, which is, the first island chain is about 300, 400 miles east of the mainland China. This is another 500, 600 miles east of that. And they crossed that line, and they operated in an area which demonstrated 2 points geographically. The first that jumped out to me, having served out in the Westpac on our Westpac carrier, the USS Kittiak, a while ago, was that we have to, when our carrier is home ported in Japan, in Tokyo Bay, when it leaves Tokyo, they just don't start flying jets off the carrier. Right. The air wing, the pilots in that air wing have to get requalified, recertified to be able to fly in the carrier. So they come out of Tokyo Bay, the carrier heads south, but the air wing has already come out several days earlier and flown down to Iwo Jima, where they do what they call fleet carrier landing practice, FCLPs. Right. So we have to use Iwo Jima to get our air wing recertified to then go land on the carrier and then continue on its operations for the next several months. The fact that they sent the Liaoning east of that first island chain and north of Iwo Jima, between Iwo Jima and Tokyo Bay, is to me a very clear signal that they said, we understand how you guys operate, and we're going to interdict that someday in a course of a conflict. And that is essentially a way to say, we're going to negate your 1-4 deployed carrier's capability, or make it so that your pilots can't get the certification and readiness that they need to be able to be more effective and efficient when they fly. The other one is that they operated both the Shandong just west of the second island chain and the Liaoning on the east side, but it was all around Guam. And they were essentially putting pressure on Guam, which should, be of concern not just to the Navy, but also to the Air Force, because of the bomber and Air Force capabilities that we retain in Guam. And so we have known and we have seen Chinese carrier strike groups operate west of Guam before, but this is the first time one has operated east. And they were doing both at the same time, which is a demonstration of their intent to surround Guam and put Guam at risk. And I say the last geographic issue is, on the way out, the Liaoning went through the Miyako Strait, which is near Okinawa, and went far south east of the Philippines and Mindanao. And we know that the Chinese, over the course of the last several years, have been really ramping up their aggression against the Philippines, especially since the Marcos administration's come in. And so this is another demonstration to the Philippine government that, hey, we're not just going to harass you and attack you and have capabilities with our 7 islands that we built in the Spratlys between 2013 and 2015, but we're also going to threaten you from your east. And that's the same message that they've had against Taiwan over the last 3 years, operating their first 2 carriers east of Taiwan. So this is a really significant sea change in the Chinese operational tempo. And sometimes some of the writers in DC, some of the think tank people, they'll talk about the Chinese have plateaued in their activities and operations. This is a clear ramp up into a new plateau of operations that demonstrates their aspirations to control not just the first and second island chain, but to be able to project power beyond the region.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up about the Beltway bandit folks. I mean, look, there's smart people everywhere, and I know that the folks that work in these think tanks and in the Beltway are very smart people, and I don't want to disparage them, but it seems like people like you that are outside of that area have a much more clear-eyed view of the Chinese Communist Navy, especially, Jim, because I can't tell you how many times that I've had John Mills on, now you, and others talking about China's activities around Taiwan. And invariably, somebody brings up the fact that the U.S. Navy only has 275 ships at this point, and the Chinese has over 300. But that's okay because we have them on a technological advantage. Do you see that as accurate anymore? I don't see that as accurate, to be honest with you, based on what we know, just from a commercial perspective.
Well, Rob, in the book behind me that we wrote, Dr. Brad Thayer and I wrote, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure, we talk about this mindset that you've just outlined very well, and we call it threat deflation. And so we have, for whatever many reasons, but it is a way that folks have been able to mitigate and explain away why we don't need to do more in this arena of preparing ourselves for the next threat, which is China, and that the threat isn't going to be like the last 35 years of going after Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden or other terrorist groups in the Middle East, which were all valid targets in many ways, and we did an excellent job as a nation. But we had not prepared ourselves for a maritime theater and a maritime conflict. And so by saying that, well, we may not have as many ships, but we're technologically superior, is a way for us to explain away and tell Congress and tell the American people we don't have to change what we're doing, and we're going to continue to buy and sell and spend in the Department of Defense on a prioritization schedule that doesn't recognize the real threat. If we really recognize the true nature of the threat from the PRC, we'd be really questioning why we're spending more money on Army programs or even increasing the size of ground forces in the Army as opposed to massively restructuring to rebuild our Navy and to make sure that we have the proper weapon systems afloat that can fight and win a war at sea and also defend against these anti-ship missiles that they have built over the last 25 years. So it's a real conundrum, and we just have to speak out more against it because there's a lot of false information there. The Chinese weapons are on par with ours in many areas. In some areas, they're superior. So the idea that we have to say that they're technologically inferior and therefore it doesn't matter how many ships they have is just a false assumption. It's threat deflation, and we need to wake up and recognize not only does mass quantity have a quality all of its own, but their quantity also has a very good quality, and we should be very, very concerned about that because as we continue to send our ships and our aircraft out into the Western Pacific, they're increasingly more at risk of attack and defeat, and that should not be acceptable to the American people.
Yeah, absolutely right. I was very surprised, and I don't know why I didn't know this. And we've got to take a break here in a second, but I'll just lay this out there for the beginning of our next segment. Is that it's been since 2007, 18 years, that a carrier battle group from the United States has been in the Taiwan Straits. I wasn't aware of that until I read your article. I think that's important. We need to talk about that. And we'll hear from the person that's the current Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, Elbridge Colby, from 2 years ago. This clip in the cold open in the next segment is from 2 years ago. Keep that in mind. This is going to blow you away. We'll be right back with Jim Fennell, career naval intelligence officer and China expert on the Rob Maness Show.
mean, my view is that China is a true near peer or peer superpower. The economy is likely to continue growing. By some metrics, how you measure economic size is itself a matter of debate. I mean, the Chinese have a much larger industrial base than we do. They have a much larger shipbuilding industry than we do. They are competing with us at the forefront of technology. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute, a very respected think tank in Australia, judged recently that China was ahead of us in most areas of high technology. So my view is that my fear is that we are talking a lot about China, but basically the mental model and the strategic model is more or less the same. And my view on the Ukraine war, I support the Ukrainians. I think what the Russians are doing is evil. I think the Ukrainian cause is just. But I think my fear is that on both sides there's this element, including in the Republican Party, that we can just kind of do this, and as John Kirby regularly says, walk and chew gum. And I'm thinking to myself, well, walk and chew gum, that's not, I mean, you're walking or are you chewing gum with China? How about like sprinting a marathon? That would give me a sense of what we're dealing with China. And my view is, if we take on China in that way, we can provide the right set of incentives for, the proper set of incentives for China, also be restrained in the appropriate ways in what we demand of China, not over-existentialize it. That's the best route for ultimately getting to détente, which I think is our goal. But if we try to get to détente now, I think we're more likely to get taken advantage.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's More War Monday, and we're talking China again because China's now got 3 aircraft carriers, 2 full-up carrier strike groups that have operated now beyond the second island change. They've even done some extended operations bracketing Guam off of the east coast of Mindanao and the Philippines, northern Philippine Islands, out towards Japan, where our forward deployed aircraft carrier, the U.S. George Washington, is located at, just to make the point that they can and will project their power, their sea power and air power, through these aircraft carriers. And the third aircraft carriers, even among the same class as the Gerald Ford, it has high-tech catapults and those kind of things. And my guest today is James Fennell, career naval intelligence officer, was the China expert and the China intelligence officer out in the Pacific Fleet. Jim, when your book that you and Bradley Thayer wrote, you talk about this, and that was Elbridge Colby from 2 years ago, by the way. We're still saying those very same things. As a matter of fact, he's now USD policy, and he's continuing to get a little grief, it seems like, especially from the mainstream media and the pro-war types that want to continue to throw every resource the U.S. has at Ukraine. And we just moved 2 carriers over to the Middle East again and took them out of the Pacific when we did that. But look, I mean, we've only got 11 aircraft carriers, soon to be 10 with this delay in the USS John F. Kennedy and the new Gerald Ford class one, right?
That's right. We are down. We're going to go down to 10. I like to tell people, when I joined the Navy in 1986 and got commissioned, we had 15 aircraft carriers and we had almost 600 warships and submarines. So today we have half of that. And if you go back that time, China's essentially doubled over the last decade and a half. So they've gone up and doubled in size, and we've gone down. These are strategic trend lines that anybody that works in the Pentagon should have been able to forecast 20 years ago or more and be able to say, we need to do something to prepare for this. And we didn't. And the issue with the carriers, it's really, there's been a debate inside the Pentagon. There's a lot of folks that say, well, you've been telling us that all these Chinese anti-carrier ballistic missiles and anti-ship cruise missiles are so deadly, therefore that makes the carrier a prime target, and therefore we don't need them because they're going to be sunk in the first 15 minutes of a conflict. And that's an overstatement. And the reality is that, we have just seen, strikes on Tehran here in the last few weeks. We saw what it means to be a fixed facility, like a nuclear production facility or an air base or an army installation or a port. They're fixed. They can't move. And so one of the things that ships at sea and aircraft at sea and things of that nature at sea is it gives you a mobility that you don't have on land. And when you consider that the size of the Pacific Ocean is 20 times the size of the continental United States, that's a whole lot of territory to hide in. And so while the Navy hasn't been building a lot of ships, they haven't been sitting by and doing nothing. And they have been working on countermeasures to help defeat or deter the impact of these missiles. It's not a 100% assurance that we can defeat every missile, but we have systems that can help defer that. And if we build more carriers and we have more ships, it means more targets for the Chinese to try to find. And having spent a career trying to find what I used to call hulks of metal at sea, whether they were Chinese hulks of metal or Russian, Soviet, or North Korean, it's not an easy job to find ships at sea, especially when they turn off all their electronics and go into hiding. And so we have a capability in the carrier force that the Chinese recognize. And that's why they have continued to pursue their carrier fleet, both their conventional fleet, which we're talking about so far, but we need to also acknowledge that in the space of the last 5 years, they've built 4 amphibious assault helicopter carriers, 3 Type 075s that are 40,000 tons that can launch, helicopters and other platforms from these amphibious helicopters. They also last year, in the end of last 2024, they launched the new Type 076 Sichuan, which is a combination of amphibious assault helicopter carrier and amphibious dock landing ship. It's 50,000 tons, and it also has electronic magnetic aircraft launch system, which the Fujian does in our USS Ford. So they have skipped a generation, they've skipped the steam generation, and they've gone into mass production of both their amphibious air power capability to be projected primarily against Taiwan and other targets in the South China Sea and in the Ryukyus, but they're also got their conventional carrier force. So we're seeing carriers being used and developed by the Chinese. And they know, in a sense, that we don't have the same kind of missile systems, but we're developing them, and they know that we will. But they're not discounting the impact of a large body of water where there are no road networks, there are no mountain passes, there are no defined territorial choke points except for a very few, like the Malacca Strait and think the first island chain, some points there. But when you're out in the deep blue ocean, you're really tough to find, and they're practicing for that and they're preparing for that. And we should not discount what they're doing. And as they move progressively further and further to the east, the war becomes more and more about carrier or ship, what's called war at sea. And we need to be prepared for war at sea. Unfortunately, the Department of Defense has spent the last 35 years preparing for war in the land domain, which we need that as well. I'm a little bit different with Bridge on this idea of walking and chewing gum. He's right. We need to be able to do one thing, at least when it comes to China, and we haven't prepared for that. I think the real issue is, as a nation, are we preparing our nation to understand that we're going to have to be able to do both? We need to be balanced in terms of national defense, like we were in the Cold War with the Soviets, where we had a large ground force that protected us against the Soviets marching across Western Europe, but we also had a large Navy at the same time. We need to urge congressional leaders, and we need to educate the American people that we need to build that capacity up, and it will take some time. So in the near term, we have to make some tough priority decisions, and I recommend that we really focus on the naval aspect, and we should not discount the role and position of carriers, because if we build too few carriers, the entire carrier infrastructure, which is not just the ships themselves, it's not just the crews that man the ships, but it's those air wings and those squadrons and the aircraft that go into it and the radars and the communications and all of that system, which is having served, first 20 years of my career on carriers, it's very, very complex. It's as complex as a space program was to NASA back in the 60s. I mean, it is really, really complex. And if you let it atrophy and you start chopping off carriers here and there, the system could collapse upon itself and not be sustained. And if that were to happen, we would be hard-pressed to ever resurrect it. And the Chinese have learned from that, and that's where they're going. And so I think that's the real concern that I have, is that we're opting out for the cheap because we look at the current budget and say, well, that's all we have. We can't do anything else. So we're accepting a defeatist mindset without really arguing and fighting for what really needs to be done. Fleet and forward deployed forces, whether they're Army, Navy, Air Force, those people that live on the front line are doing the war planning, know what goes into the requirements. Those requirements from the forward deployed forces, like they did during the wars in the Middle East, the same respect for those requirements should be funneled back into the Pentagon and given priority.
Yeah, you mentioned the mobility of these floating airfields. Really is what they are, and it's one of the things that I've been talking about from a strategic air power perspective, because you have to think about the Pacific theater from a strategic perspective, both with naval power and air power, a lot more than you have to Europe, the battlefield of Europe. In the old Cold War, you mentioned that we're positioned ourselves for the massive maneuver ground war, backed up by air support, but with long range and tactical aircraft and aircraft carrier strike groups basically surrounding the continent through the Med, but also being able to address Soviet-style surface action groups that would be out in the Pacific or Indian Ocean and those kind of things. So we were a much larger force. But this Cold War, when we talk about it, we kind of get pushback from people because they think in that mindset. This is totally different. It's a much more difficult task because you don't have dirt to put assets on. Men, machinery, logistics, bullets, beans, all of that. It's all done almost entirely by air and sea, and mostly by sea. So that whole system you're talking about being complex, I fully get it. And where do you think, before we go to this next break real quick, where do you think we're at from the ability to project power enough and consistently enough to where China looks at us and goes, oh, we're not going to go to war with them in the Pacific? Where are we at? Because we're still relying really in large part on our Cold War capability there, and it really wasn't that big in the first place.
Right, Rob. If you look at the force structure posture, of the U.S. and the Chinese in the Western Pacific, ours has basically been flatlined for the last 35 years. We have one forward deployed carrier, which is a group of 8, 9, 10 ships. We have a half a dozen or so submarines, nuclear fast attack submarines that are very good and much better than the Chinese and can bring in TLAMs and things of that nature. But that's it. It really hasn't advanced. We built a Desron, a destroyer squadron down in Singapore that has these small littoral combat ships that don't have anti-ship cruise missiles, by the way. So we have that's about the one thing that we've done down there. We've upgraded P3s to P8s. We've done a few other things. But that's a flat line, whereas the Chinese have dramatically increased. And so we're facing a structure out there that it needs to be made more robust. It needs to be more numbers so that they can be deterred. We haven't deterred them in any way, shape, or form. They're now crossing the center line of the Taiwan Strait that they never did only 4 times in 60 years before 2020. Now they're crossing it hundreds of times a month sometimes and 1,000 times more a year. They're surrounding Taiwan. They're doing all kinds of things that show that they're not deterred. So that's the real issue.
Exactly right. And we got to take another break. When we come back, we'll see a little clip about a piece of legislation that's intended to deter, but what it does is highlights our weakness and our lack of political will and our lack of prioritization against China. And it's pretty glaring. We'll be right back with James Fennell.
You woke up with a sore throat and a low-grade fever. You know you are getting sick, so here's your choices. You can get sicker and miss work, try to see a doctor this week, or sit hours in a crowded waiting room at urgent care.
I have a smarter option for you. Open your medical emergency kit, match your symptoms to doctor-recommended prescription in your booklet, and take the right meds now and get well faster.
This is not a first aid kit. It's like having an urgent care in your home. It includes doctor-prescribed medications to treat over 39 medical issues like respiratory infections, strep throat, pneumonia, UTIs, and more.
No waiting to see the doctor and no standing in line at the pharmacy. It's right here.
Every home should have at least one medical emergency kit, and here's how to order.
Go to worldviewhealthcare.com. Your kit to treat dozens of common and serious illnesses is rushed to your door. worldviewhealthcare.com. That's worldviewhealthcare.com.
The emergency kit available at worldviewhealthcare.com. Make sure you don't have to go to urgent care. I got pneumonia. I didn't have to go. I took this last year. Stayed at home, went to bed.
In a strong bipartisan move, the U.S. House of Representatives has unanimously passed the Taiwan Conflict Deterrence Act of 2025, a bill aimed at stopping a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan by hitting Beijing's top officials where it hurts financially. The legislation introduced by Republican Lisa McClain and Democrat Brad Sherman requires the U.S. Treasury to impose immediate sanctions if China attacks Taiwan. It targets senior members of the Chinese Communist Party, including Politburo and Central Committee members involved in Taiwan policy. Sanctions include freezing U.S.-based assets and publicly exposing details of CCP officials' financial holdings. The bill also mandates publishing these details in Chinese and other languages, aiming to alert Chinese citizens to the extent of elite corruption. McClain said, "We're sending a clear message. If the CCP starts a war over Taiwan, its corrupt leaders will pay the price." She emphasized the legislation is designed to prevent conflict, not provoke it. The bill follows a 2025 intelligence report revealing that the Xi Jinping family and other CCP elites hold millions of dollars in hidden investments abroad, some still active as of 2024. This isn't Congress's only move. Just last week, the House passed the So Honest Map Amendment, banning Pentagon maps from showing Taiwan as part of China, and approved $500 million in military aid to Taiwan through the 2026 Defense Bill. The Taiwan Conflict Deterrence Act must now pass the Senate and receive the president's signature to become law. But the message is already clear. Any aggression against Taiwan will come at a heavy financial and political cost.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's More War Monday, and we're talking about what job one ought to be for the United States of America. And it's that right there, deterring China, not just from attacking Taiwan, but deterring China from daring to make a decision to maybe even go to war against the Western allies and the United States in the Pacific, where we have territory, like in that second island change around the territory of Guam. And those kind of things. And my guest today is former career naval intelligence officer, was the senior officer for China in the Office of Naval Intelligence, James Fennell, and an author. He and Brad Thayer wrote a great book called Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. Jim, that little clip there about a piece of paper, to me, when I saw it, I'm like, oh, this really makes the point very quickly. And that is, you can do all the things you want to do and sign papers, get the president to sign that little deterrence act into law and say, yeah, we're going to put sanctions, heavy financial sanctions personally on all the leadership, et cetera, of a country. But if you don't have the iron and the flesh and blood people to back that up with a true capability, that doesn't mean a thing, does it? It just stood out to me as this is how weak we really are.
I couldn't agree more, Rob. I mean, we have been warning about this for a quarter of a century. We've been talking about it in those that have served in the Pacific, regardless of your service. And the threat has been there. The trend lines have been there, like I mentioned earlier, about the declining size of half the size of the U.S. Navy in 30 years, while the Chinese have doubled, and other things. They built a strategic rocket force. They've built a cyber support force, an information support force now. They've built their air forces. They're sending their air forces. We just saw Chinese Air Force doing air-to-air refueling with the Egyptian MiG-29s in Egypt a month and a half ago. I mean, incredible things and demonstrations of capability that the expert class in D.C. said could never happen, would never happen. I remember being in D.C. in 2006 and 8 at the Office of Naval Intelligence, and people said, oh, they'll never have a carrier. Now they have 3, and they're working for a 4th in conventional carriers, and they built 4 amphibious carriers. That's what matters, is what you actually do. You have organizations like that measure how much money is spent on defense budgets in all these various countries, and the Chinese are very adept in their information warfare campaign to point out, well, no, the United States' budget's $1 trillion for Defense Department, and ours is just $250 billion. So we're not a threat. And I like to always remind people, it's not what you spend, but it's what you get. If you take 2 people off the street and you give them $100 each, and you say go to the store and shop and bring back something for the family, the person that brings back more food is the person that's done a better job. And that's what the Chinese have been doing. They've been building and building their military in a remarkable fashion and rate, while we have essentially built more layers and layers of bureaucracy that hasn't really delivered on the hardware that's needed. And now that we're in this age of AI, artificial intelligence, I'm very concerned that we're going down the same path that we did 10, 12 years ago at the end of my time in service in early 2015. It was cyber this, cyber that, and you would see the building shift. Everyone was talking about cyber. It was cyber, and all the budget submissions were oriented around cyber and cyber forces. We take a huge chunk of money that could have been used to build the ships and the ammunition that we need, and buy the personnel that we need to do the maintaining and all that kind of stuff. And instead, we shifted into these, what I like to call shiny objects. And so here's AI as the new shiny object that I see the Pentagon dealing with. And I have, good colleagues and friends that share our views, but they're advocates of, well, we're going to do AI and we're going to have, drones, and that's going to be able to defeat the Chinese out there. Well, one, I don't think little drones we can call them whatever size you want to call them, but the drone fleets that are being used in the Ukraine are not going to be the same kinds of munition or weapon systems that are going to find and fix and win a war at sea in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, the one that's 20 times the size of continental United States. So there's some reasons we have these big ships that go to sea, because they have been tested and tried, and they're the pinnacle of centuries and centuries of focus on how do we fight and stay afloat and be able to maintain our ability to defend our nation and win and power project. And those systems are what we have today. Now, they can be improved, they can be added to by AI, and there's drones and things of that nature that are being introduced to the fleet, unmanned vessels and unmanned aircraft that can do refueling, that can do intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, scouting operations, all kinds of good stuff on that. But the basic structure is still there, and we need to be thinking about, why are we not building that? And part of my criticism in the book is, we have a lot of admirals, 4-star and 3-star admirals that have served over the last quarter century, and not one of them has stood up and said, I can't accept what we're doing. We're gutting the Navy. We're gutting our capabilities right at the time as a peer adversary, as Colby called it, maybe even a superior peer adversary, is emerging and to challenge us in this maritime domain of the Pacific. And, we say, well, that's a foreign war. What do we care about the rocks in the South China Sea? Or what do we care about Taiwan? It's not worth fighting for, just like some people say about the Ukraine. But the reality is that the geographic significance of those positions are have been the guarantors of our safety in the Pacific since World War II. We fought, and Americans died in the thousands in these islands in the South Pacific, in Saipan and in Okinawa and in Tarawa and all these places, Guadalcanal. They died there so that we could maintain a system of peace and stability, which the Pacific has largely enjoyed over the last 80 years. So when people say, well, what do we need this for? The answer is, well, you need it for so that you can make sure that you maintain stability in the Western Pacific region, because if that becomes unstable, that is an open door. It's the cork out of the bottle for the Chinese to be able to expand and extend their aggression, not just in the Western Pacific, but out to the Central Pacific and maybe our West Coast. And that should concern people. And they say, well, they're not anywhere near that capability today. I got it. But they weren't anywhere near that capability to have the force structure that they have today 20 years ago. When everybody 20 years ago told me, don't worry about it, they're not going to be able to do this and this and this. Well, now they have the capability to do these things. And so when somebody tells me not to worry again, I just can't accept that argument. It's a failed argument. And the trajectory that the Chinese are on, even if their economy is under duress, the prioritization for the Chinese Communist Party is to build that PLA and to build it to be able to expand their influence and power kinetically and non-kinetically into the Western Pacific and globally. And they've told us that they have global aspirations. The Global Security Initiative, the Global Defense Initiative, the Global Civilization Initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative. That's their goal, and they're moving forward on it. And if they can achieve their goals without firing a shot, they'd love to do that. But they have prepared themselves, and they understand throughout history, the people that rule are the people that got the biggest gun, and they're building the biggest gun on the planet.
Yeah, and that biggest gun being almost omnipotent. You just walk through all the global initiatives and the Belt and Road Initiative, Jim. I mean, you and I and our colleagues, we've been talking about this for a decade now, really, or more, from that perspective. And it's so obvious that with this aircraft carrier strike groups, and you didn't even talk about the unique drone aircraft carrier yet that they're building that nobody else in the world has. That I'm aware of anyway. I don't think the United States has worked on one dedicated to just drone air operations. But that is a global reach and global influence capability that they're building. From a military tactically perspective and close strategic operational perspective, we see them in the Western Pacific and branching out into the Pacific. But really, it's a global effort, isn't it? Before we get to the next break.
Oh, yes, it is, Rob. And I mean, it's not done on the same timeline that, this is some of the criticisms you get from the folks in D.C. and the Beltway is, well, they don't have the number of bases that the American military has. Well, hold on a minute. The reason they don't have that is because they didn't fight and lead a global war against both Adolf Hitler and the Imperial Japanese military in World War II. We were spread around the world because of what we did and the capabilities that we built in those right before the war started and in the first 3 years of the war, that Two Ocean Navy Act that saved our bacon, if you will. So we did this over an 80-year period, and then they criticize that and say, well, they don't have it today, so therefore it's not a worry. Well, hold on, shipmate. We need to be a little bit more objective. I was on a Chinese frigate in Kiel, Germany in 2018, and they had just come off 3.5 months of operations in the Gulf of Aden. And their sailors and their ships look like the sailors and ships that I served on when I came into the Navy. They were hungry, their ships were squared away, and they had been at sea for a long, long time. And the fact that they're, they don't have the base structure that we have today, that doesn't mean that they don't have the capacity. Because they have the Belt and Road, and they have these initiatives where they're pulling ships into France and other places to get refueled and resupplied because of the Belt and Road agreements. And they've established and built a new base out in Djibouti, and they've done NEO, non-combatant evacuation operations in Libya, in Yemen. They've done a lot of things. They're operating with the Russian Navy in the Mediterranean, all around Japan. They've surrounded Japan. They operate with the Russians in the Baltic. They have research vessels in the Southern Atlantic. I predict within the next 5 years, they'll have carriers operate, or not carriers, but nuclear submarines, Chinese nuclear submarines will be able to operate in the Atlantic. So they have global aspirations. They're on their own timeline. And just because it doesn't match some estimate from some PhD at MIT doesn't mean that it's not a lethal threat.
Yeah, just because it doesn't look like the infrastructure that we built over 80 years, like you said, we won a global war, doesn't mean that it's not there, and it is there. The Belt and Road Initiative proves it. We'll be right back, Jim. I got to take this last commercial break. I want to talk shipbuilding with Captain Pinnell because he's been looking at the Pacific Ocean and the Indo-Pac area for a long, long time from a military threat perspective, but also from, most importantly, from a logistics capability perspective and what you have to be able to do to deter and win, if necessary, against a country like China. We'll be right back with James Pinnell.
Admiral, in the last 2 decades, we've doubled the amount of money we have given the Navy to build ships. We've actually had fewer ships today because we've retired more than we've built. Tell me why in 30 seconds.
Well, the simple answer, sir, is we were building 4 or 5 DDGs a year in the mid-90s, and we're building 2 a year now. So
why?
That's the
We've
simple
given
math.
you more money.
Well, they cost more money, sir.
How much money do you need to catch up to China?
I'll have to get back to you on the specific answer. I think I'd be satisfied in the meantime to just build at the rate we're supposed to and not be behind.
Mm-hmm. How far behind are we?
We're behind in every ship class to different rates, but at least years.
We can't catch up without our private sector shipyards, can we?
We cannot.
Okay. Both Tier 1 and Tier 2 shipyards, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. We've got to do better, Admiral. It's unacceptable.
Welcome back to the Rob Maness Show. It's More War Monday, and we got to do better, Admiral. That's as simple as it gets. Our job right now, number one, should be building to deter the Communist Chinese Party, the People's Republic of China, which, as my guest today, James Pinnell, former senior and career intelligence officer and senior China officer at the Office of Naval Intelligence, has said this whole hour that China is building and is actually doing it. They're not just building now, they are actually doing it to operate globally. And I think, and so do a lot of other folks, think that its intent is to displace the United States of America as the world's global power that has the ability to operate anywhere it chooses at any time it chooses. And Jim, welcome back. Shipbuilding, I've been writing about it I acknowledge I'm an Air Force bomber guy, but I did go to the Navy War College for senior officer War College. But shipbuilding is much more than what Admiral Kilby and Senator Kennedy was just talking about there. They were just talking about naval ships, U.S. Navy ships. They weren't really talking about one of the things that I'm very concerned about, which is the ability to move stuff and people across the vast Pacific and to control those lines of communication in order to do that and have the capability to do that. Just how far behind are we when it comes to combining that concept of merchant marine with the U.S. Navy capital ships that we need to be able to fight a war?
Well, Rob, our merchant marine fleet is in dire straits as well. It doesn't get the same amount of attention because it's not as sexy, I guess, in terms of talking about missiles and weapons and things of that nature. But our shipbuilding industry writ large is really a small fraction of what the PRCs is. The PRC produces over essentially 50% of the world's ships, and we produced, I think, in the last couple of years, less than 1%. And South Korea and Japan make up the rest of that number. So it's China, South Korea, Japan, and we are just not even on the map. And so this is a real shift from what it was 80 years ago. And we've allowed our shipbuilding industry to atrophy and decline. And so what you're hearing people talk about, like the senator mentioned, our private shipyards are important because right now we have essentially, very few shipyards, U.S. Navy shipyards that produce our warships. We have less for our commercial vessels, and we go out and, essentially we don't have the same number. And so there was a report from the Office of Naval Intelligence that got leaked a year ago. It was an unclassified slide from the Office of Naval Intelligence. And it basically said that China's ship production capacity was over 220 times the size of the United States. That's for ships of all classes. And so we're in a bad way there. And that's why I keep arguing or recommending that we do something dramatic in terms of the Congress and the president working and saying we need to do something to incentivize the nation. We incentivize Silicon Valley to do AI. We incentivize big pharma to make pharmaceuticals. We do a lot of incentivization as the government to do things, but in this case, we haven't done really much. The Trump administration now has, so I give them credit. They've come in and he's passed some executive orders, and the Congress is getting attention to it. But it needs to be ramped up here in the next budget cycle much more dramatically. And we also have folks that are reaching out and working with our allies. So we have friends in Korea, we have friends in Japan, we have friends in the Philippines. The Philippines has shipbuilding capacity. And so I know that there are American citizens that are working to help find ways where we can work with our allies and partners to have them be places where they can build platforms and ships that can help the United States. But when it comes to logistics in our USNS, U.S. Naval Ship System, we outmatch the Chinese Navy in terms of resupply ships. But that's changing, and China's recognized that. And they had an Admiral Wu Shengli, former commander of the PLA Navy, over a decade ago that understood this. He learned it from us, and he said, okay, we're going to start building our own resupply ships. And so they're on their way to building those ships that will allow them to have global operations. But we need to be able to provide and assure the goods and services that we trade as a nation, or as you said, to be able to put pre-positioned supplies and forces in the theater that can be maneuvered around even in peacetime so that as not to be so vulnerable. That needs to be dramatically improved as well and looked at as part of this overarching U.S. shipbuilding program. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And as I mentioned, and I think 2 segments ago, when you lose that understanding of how to build these systems and these shipyards and shipbuilding capabilities and tools, they're very hard to reconstitute. So if you don't know how to have people that know how to build ships, let alone to get them to sea, and you don't know how to build the dry docks and the shipyards and and have the people that know how to bend metal, and we're not training them out of high school in these, schools, instead of sending them off to university to get a PhD in something that doesn't matter, but to actually have a skill that they can use and carry throughout their lives. That's what America needs to be thinking about. This is integrated whole, but if we were to move into that direction where we were training people in how to build ships, it would not only be a benefit to them in their personal lives and their family lives and the stability to have a long career in a certain industry that would provide them the wherewithal to be able to buy a house and live the American dream, but it would also provide us the foundations of our national security that we need to have, not only to deter the PRC, but in the worst case, to be able to fight and win.
Yeah. What would a program, in the people do not yell at me in the comments, but I'm going to use this term. What would a program like Warp Speed, on the shipbuilding basis, both merchant marine, U.S. Navy supply ships and warships, what would that have to look like? I live down here on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. We have Ingalls Shipbuilding. Bollinger just got the contract for the icebreakers that we don't have that they're working on, and those kind of things. But we need more shipyards, Jim, and we need them fast, and we need more people trained. And there are great programs in community college here. You can go take a ship fitting class. It takes 3 months to get trained in it, and then go get a entry-level job with Ingalls Shipyard or any of the shipyards around here. So what does something like that look like? Because I think you're right. The Trump administration is trying, but we got to do something that's fast and sustainable and permanent here in our country, even though our allies will be great partners in the near term, but in the long term, we got to get this done, don't we?
Oh, no question about it, Rob. We need to have this capacity in the United States as a foundation. So if we take short-term fixes to do things with partners, that's great, but we have to build this in America. So we have to have congressional laws that incentivize the building of shipyards, which includes lifting of environmental regulations and restrictions that prevent people from building a shipyard. We need to do more in this training that you mentioned. When I joined the Navy, I was in college and went through officer candidate school, and I'm very close with my father, and he would advise me on different things that we had talked throughout my high school years and college years about career fields and things of that nature. Mm-hmm. And he advised me to go to college and things, and he kind of shepherded me along to where I got to go and join the Navy. But I had other options, But the point was that that was where everybody was going. It was where the future was. If I was to have a son today that was at that same age, I'd advise my son to go to junior college and get a credential in shipbuilding, because that's where I think the future of the nation is people that can do things with their hands, that can't be taken away by somebody from an AI perspective. Yeah, they're going to be robots and things of that nature, but we're going to need people that are going to be able to get inside the skin of a ship and do that kind of detailed work that a robot can't do, that somebody with a thinking brain can do. And that's where the future is. And so we need to incentivize that through tax breaks. We need to incentivize it through deregulation of all this kind of environmental nonsense. We need to diversify. Right now our naval ports, we basically have San Diego and we have Norfolk. Mm-hmm. Now we have something up in Bremerton, but for the most part, we don't have anywhere near the number of naval bases and shipyards that we had 30, 40 years ago. Well, we need to go back to what John Lehman did during the Cold War and say, hey, we need to have many more. We need to diversify. Right. So let's go back and see. Let's undo some of the BRAC things. Let's see if we can reclaim some of those areas. Now, that's probably going to be politically impossible. I just saw that there was a lawsuit up in Seattle this week where somebody complained about the Blue Angels scaring their cat, and that was used as justification. So we have larger challenges in other ways about American patriotism and what that means. But in the course of doing this, we need to reconstitute patriotism and about what this means and how it is eventually for your benefit. And we can protect the environment. I'm not saying destroy the environment. I like to surf. I like good, clean water. But the point is, we don't need to have it so onerous that nobody wants to invest and take the risk. that many did back in those days. And so it's a combination of private industry, government, sponsorship, and everything else that we can do to raise this issue. And so the reason we haven't done it, I kind of blame, there's a lot of people that have responsibility in this over the last 35 years. But for me as an intelligence officer, I always come back to the fact that the intelligence professionals inside the intelligence community and in our think tanks in DC, they did not provide the clear warning to the American government and the leaders of both parties over the last 35 years of the rise of China and what this meant and the true nature of communist ideology and what their true intentions were. And we used threat deflation to downplay what they were doing, and we mitigated their real ideological goals and tried to say, well, if we engage with them, they'll become like us. And we engaged with them and we became like them. That's the reality of the last 35 years.
That is the reality, my friend. Thank you so much for coming on and giving us a master's class in this. It's sorely needed. We got to get this story to the American people, and I agree with you. The intelligence services need to do better, and we have some work to do there. Captain retired James Fennell, career service intelligence officer, former senior intelligence officer for China at the Office of Naval Intelligence, and author. And you can go get the book at Amazon and anywhere else you can get books there. It's a great read, folks. Tomorrow is Paul List and the author of Mount Doom. It's all about artificial intelligence and where we're going with that. I'll see you then on Training Tuesday.